Gideon Mercer had not even finished unpacking when 6 black sport utility vehicles sealed off his driveway. A woman in a white blazer marched up without a single introduction, threw a stack of papers onto his porch, and gave him 48 hours to surrender his cabin. She claimed the homeowners association owned every tree, every road, every rock in that valley, and laughed when he refused to leave. She had no idea she was standing on land that already belonged to him, or that within days, the empire she ruled would collapse at her own front door. Stay with this story until the very end, because a woman who thought she owned a mountain is about to lose everything to the one man she never bothered to investigate. Gideon had driven his old pickup truck into Pine Hollow on a quiet afternoon in early autumn, carrying nothing extravagant. Just clothes, a few tools, some legal files, and a handful of belongings that once belonged to his late Uncle Thaddeus. Mercer. The cabin sat north of a gated community called Silver Ridge, separated from the main development by a thick stand of pine trees and nearly 2 miles of unpaved road. Thaddeus had lived there for more than 3 decades and had never once joined the homeowners association, preferring solitude to committee meetings and painted mailboxes. Gideon had not come back merely to rest after years of quiet work managing properties in larger cities. After his uncle passed away, he inherited far more than a cabin, and he intended to see exactly what that inheritance actually meant before he told anyone who he really was. The cabin itself was modest by most standards, built from thick cedar logs that had weathered decades of mountain winters, with a stone chimney his uncle had rebuilt by hand after a lightning strike years earlier. Thaddeus had chosen the spot deliberately high enough on the ridge to see the entire valley spread out below, yet far enough from any main road that most visitors never even realized the property existed. Gideon remembered visiting as a boy. Sitting on that same porch while his uncle explained in the plain, unhurried way, he explained everything that owning land meant nothing if a man could not also protect the people living on it. Those words had stayed with him through years of managing commercial properties in cities where landlords rarely met their tenants in boardrooms, decided the fate of entire neighborhoods without ever setting foot in them. Returning to Pine Hollow felt in some ways like closing a circle he had not realized was still open, though he had no idea just how quickly that circle would be tested. What Gideon now controlled, according to the documents locked away in his late uncle's safe, was staggering. He owned the cabin and the surrounding acreage outright, but he also held title to more than 1,800 acres beneath the entire Silver Ridge development, along with a 99-year land lease signed decades earlier by every homeowner who ever bought a lot there. He held the sole authority to approve or deny any commercial construction, any new internal roads, and any transfer of shared land within the community. He decided, for reasons he could not yet fully explain even to himself, to keep his identity quiet while he assessed the condition of the property before renewing or renegotiating the management agreement with the association. It was a decision that would prove to be the smartest thing he ever did. The moment he finished unloading his truck, the convoy of vehicles arrived, and the woman in white introduced herself as Priscilla Vance, president of the Silver Ridge Homeowners Association, standing beside her vice president Colton Reeves, and several nervous board members who seemed to exist mainly to nod at whatever she said. Priscilla announced that the cabin area had been rezoned by the association into what she called a resort amenity zone, insisting that Gideon was trespassing on community property and demanding he vacate within 2 days. Gideon asked with the calm patience of a man who had spent years reading contracts for a living to see her proof of ownership. She produced a map that the association had drawn up themselves, one where the community boundary had been quietly expanded to swallow his cabin and 34 acres that had never belonged to Silver Ridge at all. Gideon studied the signature at the bottom of that map and immediately recognized that it had been forged. When he told her plainly that he did not belong to her association, Priscilla only smiled and said that anyone living inside the boundaries of Silver Ridge answered to her whether they liked the arrangement or not. She warned him that if he refused to leave, the association would tear the cabin down themselves and bill him personally for the demolition. Gideon did not argue further. He simply picked up the stack of papers from his porch, looked her directly in the eye, and told her she should make absolutely certain she actually owned the thing she was trying to take from him. Priscilla laughed again, convinced she was dealing with some broke heir who understood nothing about property law, then climbed back into her vehicle and drove away with her entourage trailing behind her like an obedient parade. That night, Gideon opened his uncle's old steel safe and pulled out the original signed lease agreement covering the entirety of Silver Ridge, and buried within the paperwork he discovered something that changed the shape of everything happening around him. The Homeowners Association had stopped paying its land lease to the Mercer family nearly 3 years earlier, quietly accumulating a debt that nobody in that gated community had any idea existed. It was, he realized, no longer a simple dispute over one cabin on a hillside. It was the first thread of something much larger, something Priscilla Vance had clearly been building for a very long time, and Gideon intended to pull on that thread until the whole thing came undone, in front of everyone who lived, There. The very next morning, Gideon found a violation notice taped to his front door demanding $5,000 for infractions that read like a list assembled purely out of spite. His roof, according to the notice, was the wrong color. His truck was parked on an unapproved surface. His wooden fence failed to meet the community's aesthetic standards, and he had refused to register his residency or allow an inspection of his property. When he called the number printed on the notice, Priscilla answered personally and coldly informed him that the fine would increase by $750 every single day he remained non-compliant. He reminded her once again that he was not a member of her association, and she replied that the board had voted the previous year to formally annex his land into the community, though she refused to produce any meeting minutes, any notice sent to the landowner, or any signature proving that vote had ever legitimately occurred. Not long after that call, a metal barricade appeared across the only road leading to Gideon's cabin, erected by association workers without so much as a warning. Gideon did not tear it down or confront anyone directly. Instead, he documented everything with photographs and video, then checked the exact property coordinates against his uncle's survey maps, confirming that the barricade sat entirely on Mercer land and nowhere near any boundary. Association actually controlled. A survey crew arrived shortly afterward to stake out the area around his cabin, and when Gideon asked them to leave, their team leader casually explained they had been hired to design a new clubhouse, a 60-space parking structure, a scenic overlook, and 3 short-term rental cabins all planned for a site that overlapped almost entirely with his own property. Curious and increasingly alarmed, Gideon asked the surveyor who had authorized the project, and the man produced a photocopy bearing a signature reading, simply G. Mercer, a signature Gideon knew for certain he had never written. That evening, the power to his cabin was cut, and the utility company explained that the association had reported the residence as abandoned, claiming the line needed to be disconnected for public safety. Gideon switched on a portable generator and called Warren Pike, a real estate attorney who had represented the Mercer family for decades and understood the tangled legal history of Silver Ridge better than almost anyone alive. Warren listened carefully, then warned Gideon that this had grown far beyond an ordinary homeowner's dispute, because forging a landowner's signature to obtain permits could constitute fraud, trespassing, and possibly a much larger financial conspiracy. Warren suggested sending a formal cease and desist letter immediately, but Gideon asked him to hold off on revealing his true identity just yet, wanting to understand exactly what Priscilla had already done across the rest of the property, before confronting her directly. The two men agreed to quietly investigate the association's construction, records its financial statements, its land lease history, its commercial licensing fees, and every permit that had been approved using a signature neither of them had ever seen before. Warren reminded Gideon that Thaddeus had always suspected something was wrong with the way Silver Ridge conducted itself, though he had never pursued it seriously, preferring simply to be left alone rather than drag the family into a costly legal fight. He pulled a thin folder from his briefcase containing a handful of letters Thaddeus had written years earlier, quietly questioning why association vehicles kept appearing on land well beyond the community's marked boundary. Nobody had ever answered those letters, and Thaddeus, already tired and increasingly private in his final years, had simply let the matter go rather than pursue it through the courts. Gideon read through his uncle's careful handwriting and felt something harden in his resolve, a sense that finishing what Thaddeus never got the chance to finish was now entirely his responsibility. That same week, Gideon's home security camera caught something unmistakable in the middle of the night footage, showing Colton Reeves and 2 security guards measuring the width of his front door and marking a spot on the ground exactly where a bulldozer blade would need to sit. Warren pulled the county land records and discovered that the association had filed a new development map 18 months earlier, one that quietly reclassified several leased parcels as permanent common property owned outright by the property owned by association. Under the original agreement, however, Silver Ridge only ever owned the structures built above ground, while the land itself remained the property of Mercer Land Holdings, the family company Gideon now controlled as its sole owner. Any change to how that land could be used legally required the landowner's signature, and Warren found at least 11 separate documents bearing a forged version of Gideon's name. Meanwhile, Gideon walked the grounds of Silver Ridge, posing simply as a new resident, discovering along the way a private restaurant serving paying outside guests, a fee-based spa, a commercial parking lot, a wedding and conference venue, 6 short-term rental homes, and an entirely new road cut straight through what was supposed to be protected forest. Every one of these ventures generated significant profit for someone, yet none of it had ever been reported to the actual owner of the land beneath it. Gideon struck up a careful friendship with Marjorie Bell, the association's longtime treasurer, who seemed guarded at first but grew visibly anxious the moment he asked about a string of unusual expense reports. She eventually admitted that Priscilla controlled every dollar that moved through the association, and routinely funneled payments to a company called Vance Community Development, a business registered under the name of Priscilla's own brother. Marjorie confessed she had objected to these transfers more than once, only to be threatened with removal from the board and legal action for supposedly disclosing confidential financial information. She explained that Priscilla had a habit of scheduling the most contentious financial votes late at night, after most residents had already gone home, ensuring only a handful of loyal board members remained to approve whatever she proposed. Marjorie had kept copies of the original invoices precisely because she feared this day might come tucking flash drives inside old cookbooks and tax folders where nobody would think to look for them. She admitted feeling ashamed for staying silent as long as she had, but explained that Priscilla controlled not just the association's money but also its reputation machine, capable of turning an entire neighborhood against anyone who challenged her. Gideon told her that coming forward now mattered far more than anything she may have failed to do years earlier, and that courage rarely arrives on a convenient schedule. Gideon still did not reveal who he really was, but he quietly encouraged Marjorie to preserve every original document she still had access to. Around the same time, Priscilla called an emergency meeting and told residents that Gideon posed a direct threat to the safety and integrity of their community, framing him publicly as a squatter attempting to seize an abandoned cabin and stir up unnecessary conflict. Some residents believed her without question, while others grew suspicious. Since Thaddeus Mercer had lived on that hillside long before Silver Ridge was ever built, Priscilla pushed through a resolution granting the board authority to reclaim the cabin entirely if Gideon refused to comply with her demands, and he soon received a final notice giving him exactly 24 hours to abandon the property, for good. Warren urged him to seek an emergency injunction from the court, and Gideon agreed, though he asked that the order not be served immediately, wanting Priscilla to bring her machinery to his door first so there would be no ambiguity about her. Attention. Before that confrontation could unfold, Everett Sloan, the county land inspector, contacted Gideon privately with information that reframed the entire situation. Priscilla, he explained, had used a forged copy of Gideon's signature to secure a loan worth $4,600,000, pledging the development rights to Silver Ridge itself as collateral for a debt the association had absolutely no legal authority to guarantee. Early on the third morning after Gideon's arrival, the low growl of heavy machinery rolled up from the road below his cabin. 2 bulldozers, a flatbed trailer, and 3 security vehicles crawled toward his property, with Priscilla stepping out in an expensive tailored suit, waving what she called an emergency demolition order issued directly by the association itself. She declared the cabin a safety hazard out of compliance with community standards and sitting illegally on shared land. Gideon asked quite calmly whether she carried an actual court order or a demolition permit issued by the county, and she answered that the association did not require judicial approval to deal with a violation inside its own jurisdiction. Standing on his porch, Gideon lifted his phone and began recording the entire scene, reading aloud the parcel number of his property and asking everyone present to confirm on camera that they had been informed this was private land. The bulldozer operator hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Priscilla threatened to withhold payment if the crew stopped working. Colton stepped forward and ordered the security guards to physically remove Gideon from his own porch, and 2 men advanced toward him until Gideon warned them without raising his voice that they were being filmed and could be charged with criminal trespassing. One guard backed away immediately while the other still reached for Gideon's arm, right as Warren Pike arrived with a court officer carrying an emergency injunction. Warren handed the order directly to Priscilla, prohibiting the association from entering the cabin's land, moving Gideon's property, cutting utilities, blocking the road, or demolishing any structure whatsoever. Priscilla read the document, but insisted the court had been misled by a manipulative outsider, ordering the bulldozer operator to continue anyway. The operator refused, outright unwilling to violate a direct court order, so Priscilla climbed onto the machine herself and tried to start it, only for Warren to warn her that doing so would constitute contempt of court and deliberate destruction of private property. She eventually backed down, though not before telling Gideon he had just turned this into a war he could never afford to win, and Gideon replied simply that she still believed this fight was about one small cabin. Once the convoy retreated, Warren showed Gideon the loan documents tied to that $4,600,000 debt, explaining that if the loan defaulted, the bank could attempt to seize development rights across all of Silver Ridge, even though the association had never legally possessed those rights in the first place. That risk threatened every homeowner in the community, not just Gideon, and he realized he needed to protect innocent buyers while dismantling the leadership that had put them all in danger. That same evening, Marjorie called him in a panic, whispering that Priscilla had just ordered every piece of the association's old financial paperwork destroyed before sunrise. Marjorie met Gideon quietly at a diner outside town, carrying a hard drive containing 7 years of duplicated financial records she had kept hidden for her own protection. The numbers revealed that Priscilla had funneled more than $1,200,000 in association dues directly into her family's private company, inflating maintenance invoices, collecting commercial land rents without ever forwarding a cent to Mercer Land Holdings, using emergency reserve funds as loan collateral, paying consulting fees to companies with no actual employees, and forging meeting minutes to push through unauthorized projects. Marjorie admitted she had signed a handful of these reports under pressure and offered to cooperate fully if she could be shielded from retaliation, and both Gideon and Warren cautioned her against gathering any more evidence on her own, worried about what Priscilla might do if she discovered the leak. Priscilla did discover it almost immediately, noticing unusual access to the backup files, and she responded by changing the locks on the association office and hiring movers to haul the paper records away for destruction. Warren rushed to secure an emergency evidence preservation order from the court, and while they waited for it to be granted, Gideon watched a delivery truck leave the association headquarters loaded with boxes, following it at a careful distance while recording the license plate, the route, and the exact location where it finally stopped. The truck led straight to a storage warehouse registered under Vance Community Development, and rather than break in himself, Gideon reported everything to Everett Sloan and to Warren, who confirmed the warehouse contained construction materials purchased with association funds that had never once appeared anywhere inside Silver Ridge. Once the preservation order came through, Deputy Marshal Tessa Rowland led a team to the warehouse, and inside they discovered dozens of boxes of association records, office computers with their hard drives, removed expansion maps for the resort project, pre-sale contracts for luxury rental cabins, demolition plans specifically targeting Gideon's home to make way for a new clubhouse, and internal correspondence discussing the need to remove Mercer before the heir ever discovered his own ownership rights. That single phrase confirmed something devastating that Priscilla had known all along. The Mercer family still legally owned the land beneath her entire operation. Her true motive finally came into focus, a plan to transform Silver Ridge into a luxury resort destination and then sell the management rights to an outside development corporation, with Gideon's cabin sitting directly on the single most valuable overlook in the whole valley. She needed that cabin gone, and gone quickly before the true owner ever had the chance to review a single document. In one seized email, Priscilla had written that if Mercer ever showed up, someone needed to make him look like a trespasser before he could prove he was the actual landowner, a line that would later prove far more damaging to her than she could have imagined. Everett Sloan found additional records showing that Priscilla had personally approved every commercial permit herself, bypassing the usual county review process by submitting falsified environmental assessments and forged engineering reports. He discovered that the 6 rental cabins had been built without proper septic permits, that the spa building diverted water from a protected creek without any license, and that the wedding venue had been operating for 2 years without a single fire safety inspection. Each violation on its own might have drawn a fine and a warning, but stacked together they painted the picture of someone who believed the rules simply did not apply to her so long as the money kept flowing into the right accounts. Warren began cataloging every violation, methodically aware that a judge would need an overwhelming volume of evidence to strip an entire board of its authority in one sweep, and he wanted no gap left for Priscilla's attorneys to exploit later. Priscilla called a special session at the clubhouse soon after, announcing a vote to reclaim Gideon's cabin, expel him from the community entirely, raise association dues to cover mounting legal costs, and approve a lucrative sale of development rights to an outside corporation. She believed that controlling the room would let her manufacture a legal shield before Gideon could act against her. Gideon arrived that evening alongside Warren, Marjorie, and Everett Sloan, and although Priscilla instructed security to keep him out, he presented documentation, confirming he held a direct and undeniable property interest in every land use decision Silver Ridge had ever made. Standing before hundreds of residents, Priscilla described him as a con artist attempting to seize association property, displaying maps and permits, bearing his forged signature as supposed proof. Gideon did not argue at first, choosing instead to ask a series of simple, pointed questions. He asked whether the association held an actual deed to the land, and Priscilla dodged, insisting the community had controlled the area for more than 20 years. He asked whether she had any transfer agreement from the Mercer family, and she claimed the older records had simply been lost over time. He asked why the association had been sending land lease payments to Mercer Land Holdings for 17 consecutive years if the land truly belonged to them, and the room fell into uneasy murmuring. Gideon then laid out one by one the original deed to the property, the 99-year lease agreement, a county-certified survey map, the association's own payment records, his uncle's certified will, and legal confirmation that he was the sole owner of Mercer Land Holdings. He told the crowd plainly that he had not moved onto association land at all, and that in fact their entire homeowners association had been built on land that belonged to him. Priscilla froze for a moment before regaining her composure and arguing that Gideon's ownership was nothing more than an outdated legal technicality, claiming the association could assert ownership through decades of continuous use. Warren calmly explained that such a claim could never succeed because the association's own history of paying rent was a clear and repeated admission that the Mercer family held legal title all along. Gideon then revealed that the association owed 3 years of unpaid land rent, that numerous structures had been built without any authorization whatsoever, that development rights had been illegally mortgaged, that his own signature had been repeatedly forged, and that the board's reckless decisions had jeopardized every resident's right to remain on that land at all. Residents began turning on Priscilla, immediately demanding explanations she no longer had any way to provide. She lashed out, calling Gideon greedy, and insisting the association would never hand him a single dollar, and Gideon replied evenly that he had not come there for money at all, only to end the reign of people who had been deceiving their own neighbors for years. A retired schoolteacher near the back of the room stood up and asked in a shaking voice whether her monthly dues had truly been paying for a private company owned by Priscilla's own brother, and Priscilla had no honest answer to give her. A younger couple who had just closed on their first home 2 months earlier asked whether their mortgage was now at risk because of a resort loan they had never even heard about until that night, and the silence that followed told them everything they needed to know. Gideon assured the room that no honest homeowner would lose their house over decisions made behind their backs, a promise he intended to keep no matter how the legal proceedings unfolded in the months ahead. Marjorie stepped forward at that point, and with her voice trembling told the crowd she had tried for years to raise these exact concerns internally, only to be threatened into silence every single time, and several longtime residents nodded, remembering her quiet resignation from committee after committee over the years. As the room descended into chaos, Deputy Marshal Tessa Rowland walked through the doors, carrying a search warrant, an order to seize every remaining association record, and a formal notice freezing all association bank accounts effective immediately. In the days that followed, with her accounts frozen but no arrest yet made, while investigators built their case, Priscilla turned to a last desperate campaign, sending residents a message accusing Gideon of plotting to evict every homeowner, tear down all of Silver Ridge, raise land rents tenfold, and sell the entire valley to a logging conglomerate. None of it was true, but the fear it created was real enough that a group of frightened residents marched to Gideon's cabin demanding answers. He did not react with anger. Instead, he calmly showed them the original lease agreement and offered a written commitment that no compliant homeowner would ever lose their right to remain, explaining that his only goals were protecting the existing land agreements, voiding the fraudulent debts Priscilla had created, replacing the corrupt leadership entirely, and ensuring innocent residents never bore the financial consequences of her actions. That transparency slowly began winning people over one skeptical neighbor at a time. Around the same period, Colton approached Gideon privately, offering to testify in exchange for immunity and revealing that Priscilla intended to move the remaining $600,000 in reserve funds into an offshore account before investigators could freeze it. Gideon made no promises to him, insisting only that any real evidence needed to go directly to the authorities handling the case. Priscilla discovered Colton's betrayal almost immediately and drove to the association office in the dead of night, removing a backup server and a locked file cabinet, all of it captured clearly on security cameras positioned around the building. She then drove straight to Gideon's cabin and attempted to negotiate a secret settlement offering to return the cabin, erase every outstanding fine, pay a substantial cash sum, and even grant him a share of profits from the resort project, provided he publicly confirmed that the forged permit signatures were authentic. Gideon refused without hesitation, and Priscilla's composure finally cracked, entirely admitting that if this deal collapsed, she would lose everything she had built. Gideon told her quietly but firmly that she had already lost everything the moment she decided to take something that was never hers to begin with. For a brief moment, Priscilla looked less like a woman in control of an empire, and more like someone finally staring at the wreckage of her own choices, though the moment passed as quickly as it came. She left in a fury, but not before hurling a container of fuel toward the generator shed near his cabin, hoping a small fire would destroy the backup copies of evidence stored nearby. Gideon managed to extinguish it before any real damage occurred, and every second of her attempt was captured clearly on his security footage. When Tessa Rowland reviewed that recording, she announced without hesitation that what had begun as a civil investigation had officially become a criminal one. The following morning, Priscilla still showed up at association headquarters, attempting to hold a closed-door session to scrub her name from every account and shift responsibility onto Colton and Marjorie before anyone could stop her. She had no idea that Tessa Rowland already carried a warrant for her arrest. When investigators walked through the door, Priscilla insisted they were trespassing on private property and demanded someone summon the local sheriff immediately. But Tessa simply began reading the initial charges aloud. Forged signatures, financial fraud, using property she did not own as loan, collateral, obstruction of a federal and state investigation, destruction of evidence, unlawful, trespassing, arson, and conspiracy to seize real property, each accusation landing heavier than the last. Priscilla tried desperately to shift blame onto Colton and Marjorie, but Marjorie had already surrendered every scrap of financial data in her possession, and Colton produced text messages in which Priscilla explicitly ordered him to falsify voting records. The bank confirmed that the $4,600,000 loan had only been approved because Priscilla submitted forged documents claiming the association legally owned development rights it never possessed. The corporation preparing to purchase the resort project also handed over emails in which Priscilla promised to handle the Mercer heir before the sale could be finalized. Priscilla was handcuffed inside the very office where she had once posted dozens of punitive fines against her own neighbors, while Colton was detained for further questioning, and several board members were called in, though those with no direct role in the fraud were permitted to cooperate freely. As she was led outside, Priscilla spotted Gideon standing across the parking lot and screamed that he had destroyed their community with his own hands. Out replied that the community still remained fully intact, and that the only thing that had actually disappeared was her ability to control it. Shortly afterward, the court suspended the entire association board and appointed Gideon as temporary land manager while Silver Ridge underwent a complete legal restructuring. Months later, the case moved into civil court, running parallel to the criminal prosecution, with Priscilla still insisting that Gideon had exploited outdated legal technicalities to seize control of an entire mountain community. Her attorneys argued that the association had invested millions of dollars into infrastructure and therefore deserved recognition of long-term usage rights, but Warren dismantled that argument methodically, showing that the association had always known the land belonged to the Mercer family, that it had paid rent consistently for years, that Priscilla had deliberately halted those payments to hide her diversion of funds, that every commercial structure had been built without the landowner's authorization, that the maps and signatures used to justify it were forged, and that the loan itself had been secured against property the association never legally controlled. The presiding judge ultimately ruled that the board had committed a severe breach of its fiduciary duty toward every single resident who had trusted them. The judgment that followed reshaped Silver Ridge entirely, voiding every resolution that had illegally annexed Gideon's cabin land, formally confirming him as the rightful owner of the ground beneath the entire community, canceling every permit built on a forged signature, and shutting down all unauthorized commercial operations immediately. The court ordered Vance Community Development to return every dollar it had improperly received from the association, seized personal assets traceable to embezzled funds, permanently barred Priscilla from ever managing a homeowners association, nonprofit, or community fund again, and held individual board members personally accountable rather than allowing the debt to fall onto innocent residents. The old association was dissolved outright, replaced by a newly formed group with sharply limited authority. The judge specifically noted in her written opinion that the board's conduct represented one of the more brazen abuses of homeowner trust she had encountered in years on the bench, singling out the falsified environmental assessments and the forged engineering reports as evidence of intentional, brantless, calculated deception rather than mere negligence. She ordered a full third-party audit of every commercial venture operating within Silver Ridge, requiring each business to either obtain legitimate licensing within 90 days or cease operations entirely until compliance could be verified. The ruling also mandated that any future expansion of association authority required a 2/3 vote of actual homeowners, conducted through an independently verified ballot process rather than a show of hands controlled by whoever happened to be running the meeting that night. Reporters from a regional newspaper covered the ruling closely, noting that similar disputes had quietly surfaced in other mountain communities across the state, though few had ever uncovered a case where the association had literally built its entire commercial empire on land it never legally owned. The fraudulent $4,600,000 loan was voided entirely since the bank never had legal standing to accept collateral. The association did not truly own, though the bank retained the right to pursue Priscilla and the other individuals who had signed off on the fraudulent paperwork. Gideon chose not to immediately collect the 3 years of unpaid land rent owed by ordinary homeowners, instead using the funds recovered from Priscilla's seized assets to offset that outstanding debt himself. He introduced a new agreement that kept existing rent rates unchanged for current residents, prohibited any future board from expanding community boundaries without homeowner approval, required every major project to go through a resident vote mandated independent audits of all association finances, banned fines issued without a clear appeals process, and forbade any board member from personally profiting through contracts with outside vendors. Marjorie agreed to serve as a cooperating witness and received reduced liability for her assistance, while Colton was required to repay a portion of the misappropriated funds, complete community service, and accept a permanent ban from any community leadership role. Priscilla faced a lengthy prison sentence along with substantial restitution obligations, and her once impressive home inside Silver Ridge was seized to help cover the damages she had caused. The sign that once read Vance Community Center was finally removed from the clubhouse wall, and her name was erased from every operational record the community still possessed. A full year later, Silver Ridge looked almost unrecognizable compared to the fear and chaos that had once gripped it. The old association no longer existed, replaced instead by a much smaller organization called the Silver Ridge Residents Association, responsible only for maintaining shared roads, managing the water system, coordinating independent audits, organizing basic fire safety measures, and protecting the surrounding forest and natural lake. This new group had no power to seize anyone's home, erect barricades, impose arbitrary fines, or trespass onto private property, a deliberate limitation built directly into its charter. Residents offered Gideon the chairmanship, but he declined, telling them plainly that concentrating power in a single person was exactly the mistake that had created someone like Priscilla in the first place. He kept only the role of landowner and non-voting advisor, refusing any position that would let history repeat itself under his own name. The illegally constructed clubhouse was converted into a genuine community gathering space, while the unauthorized restaurant and spa remained closed until proper safety inspections and lawful lease agreements could be completed. The 6 commercial rental cabins were transformed into a shared revenue asset for the entire community, with proceeds used to lower maintenance costs for every homeowner, rather than lining a single family's pocket. The illegally logged section of forest was carefully replanted, and the road leading to Gideon's cabin was restored, though he personally removed the barricade. Priscilla had once installed, replacing it with a simple wooden sign reading, "Private Road. Silver Ridge residents welcome so long as the land is respected." Marjorie joined the community's new independent audit committee, no longer controlling finances directly but helping design a transparent system that made it far harder for anyone to repeat what had happened before. Everett Sloan oversaw the safe removal of every unauthorized structure that posed a genuine hazard, while Deputy Marshal Tessa Rowland occasionally stopped by the cabin for coffee, though their acquaintance remained nothing more than an easy, adult friendship that never distracted from the larger story unfolding around them. Colton eventually moved away from Silver Ridge, entirely taking a quiet job in a neighboring county, and rarely speaking of the years he had spent nodding, along with decisions he privately knew were wrong. The retired school teacher who had spoken up during that fateful meeting later became one of the founding members of the new Residents Association, determined to make sure no single voice could ever again dominate every decision affecting their homes. Even the young couple who had worried about losing their first house stayed on, watching their neighborhood slowly rebuild itself into something closer to what it had always claimed to be, on paper, a genuine community rather than a private kingdom disguised as one. Children who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the man who supposedly stole their clubhouse eventually learned the truth from their own parents, that the real theft had been happening quietly for years before Gideon Mercer ever arrived to stop it. In the final quiet moments of this long ordeal, Gideon sat on his porch overlooking the valley below as evening settled over Silver Ridge, when Warren arrived carrying the final documents confirming that every remaining piece of the case had officially closed. Priscilla had been sentenced to prison, ordered to pay full restitution, and stripped entirely of any financial benefit she had ever gained from her scheme. Warren asked whether Gideon regretted turning down an enormous offer from a development corporation that had once wanted to buy the entire valley outright. Gideon looked out at the scattered lights glowing softly from homes below, and answered that land could belong to one person, but a real community only survives when nobody tries to own the people living inside it. He closed the final folder of paperwork and placed it inside his uncle's old steel safe, right alongside the very first notice Priscilla had ever thrown onto his porch, the one demanding he surrender his land within 48 hours. He kept that notice not as a trophy over a woman he had defeated, but as a quiet reminder that unchecked power always begins with a request that looks small enough to ignore. Priscilla Vance had once marched onto a stranger's porch to demand land she believed was rightfully hers to control. She only discovered far too late to save herself that every road she had ever walked in that valley led directly back to the one man she never thought to question.